This Gonzaga team is obviously we're turning a new page. We're turning a new page to what this Gonzaga Bulldog team is. There is no more Drew Timme. There's no more Julian Strother. There's no more Malachi Smith. There's a lot of guys are no longer here. And it's going to look different. It's going to feel different, especially early on. This was a team that still reached the Elite Eight a year ago. This was still a team that was the co-WCC champion. This was a team that was the WCC tournament champion. They still won 31 games last year. But what are the expectations for this Zags team as they bring in a lot of new pieces? You bring in Ryan Nembhard. You bring in Graham Ike. You bring in Steele Venters. You bring in a lot of guys who have experience. You bring in guys who know how to win as well. Creighton went deep with Ryan Nembhard. Wyoming got to an NCAA tournament with Graham Ike. Steele Venters was the player of the year in the Big Sky. They brought in guys who know how to do it, and they still bring back pieces who know how to do it. Anton Watson, first and foremost, the guy who everyone's going to point to and be like, he's the anchor to this team. And I agree, he is the anchor to what Gonzaga does. Arguably the best defensive player in the league, arguably the most indispensable player in the WCC. They also bring back Nolan Hickman. They bring back Ben Gregg. Braden Huff is going to be part of that rotation likely. So 1 through 6 on this Gonzaga roster seems pretty set. Health, everyone being healthy, being the big key to that. But after that, it does get a little shaky. And I think this is where we have some questions about this Gonzaga team, is the depth. We're so used to seeing Gonzaga teams be not necessarily like rotation-wise, because we know that Mark Few doesn't have a huge rotation. He'll only go like 7, 8 players deep. But we're used to seeing Gonzaga teams that are already like 9, 10 guys deep, that you know what you're going to get. This year, going into the season, I think we only have about 6 of those guys. And 7 through 10 are question marks. What are we going to see from some of the new guys? What are we going to see from the likes of Braden Huff? Expectations, I think, are high, as they should be, but it's still unknown. You don't necessarily know what you're going to get from Dusty Stromer. It's still unknown. You still don't know what you're going to get from some of these other pieces. And that's the challenge going in. What are they going to get 7 through 10? Because I think we're pretty confident 1 through 6. You know what you're getting from Ryan Nembhard, arguably maybe going in preseason player of the year in the WCC. You know what you're going to get if healthy from Graham Ike. That's a 20-10 dude right off the gate. You know what you're going to get from him. You know what you're going to get from Anton Watson. No one is questioning what he's going to be able to do for this team. Nolan Hickman. Nolan Hickman is maybe the one guy who's the established amongst the 6 who could have a big jump this year. There's been a lot of talk, and there was talk some at WCC Media Day from Mark View about the importance that Ryan Nembhard has played on Nolan Hickman's development. Really, what it is because it allows Nolan Hickman to play off the ball, play the 2 guard, which is a much more natural position for him. One of the things that last year that was discussed a lot was that Nolan Hickman wasn't the point guard that this team needed, that he was underperforming, that he wasn't showing up night in and night out. Well, you know what? That's not where his natural inclination is. He wasn't the true point guard. And if Gonzaga had a quote point guard a year ago, we're probably looking at a team that maybe does get back to the Final Four and not just the Elite Eight. And now that they have solved the point guard problem, it has now allowed Nolan Hickman to shift back maybe to where he's more naturally fit. And that will be, I think, a huge lift for him. But we'll see as the season goes along how quickly he can fill into that. But I know there's a lot of excitement, a lot of positive thinking that this is going to be a really big year for Nolan Hickman. And then Ben Gregg. Ben Gregg is also a known commodity. One of the better big men in the league, one of the better big men on the West Coast. But he's been hiding behind Drew Timme the last couple of years, hiding behind Anton Watson the last couple of years. And he's going to be coming off the bench again this year with both Watson and EK sitting right in front of him. I mean, I expect Ben Gregg to still play a key role. He's still going to get a good amount of minutes. He may get actually a few more just because you're going to want to spell maybe EK a little bit more than you have just going into this first full year of him being back off the foot injury. So I think that is something we'll see. I think Ben Gregg will definitely play a lot more early on. We'll see how the rotation tightens up, but we know he's one of the top 6 on this roster. We know that he's going to be one of the first guys off the bench, if not the first guy off the bench for Mark Few. And then one of the other guys, we talked about Steele Venters. So for all the non-Gonzaga folks, I'm sure a lot of the Gonzaga fans watching, those who have been paying attention, are kind of up to date on who Steele Venters is and what he brings. So I mentioned that he was the Big Sky MVP transferring over from Eastern Washington this past year. This is a guy who was averaging 15 points a game last year, 37% from 3. The year before that, he was 16.7, 43% from 3. 6'7" forward. He is a senior, so he does bring some experience. He started at Eastern Washington as a walk-on. This is a guy who knows how to work. This is a guy who knows how to win. He brings a ton of experience, and he's going to give this Gonzaga roster something that it does need, and that's a 3-point shooter. They're going to need him to be able to stretch the floor because with EK and Watson kind of like taking up most of the middle, they're going to need someone like Venters to really stretch that defense and make sure that they're not collapsing upon the guys in the middle. He's also going to give Hickman and Nembhard a target out on the perimeter as well. So there's a lot to like about what Steele Venters brings to the Zags this year. A lot to kind of really think about what this team is going to look like and what wrinkles he brings to this team. Now, we can talk all day long about the expectations of this team, where we think they'll be. In the opening AP poll, which came out last week, they came out at number 11, which was 12 spots ahead of St. Mary's at 23. But the coaches picked them to be second by the slimmest of margins, but they were still picked second in the WCC. And that hasn't happened since 2017, 2018. And the last time it happened, Gonzaga ended up winning the league outright and won the tournament title. That may happen again. That may very well happen again. But I do think that the gap between Gonzaga and St. Mary's is smaller now than maybe it was a couple of years ago. Than maybe it was even a year ago. I mean, they were co-champs, so there was still that. But the gap is shrinking, and the roster, the way this is put together right now, definitely I think has them a bit closer together than maybe in a lot of years past. This Gonzaga team has a lot of unknowns, and that's probably why a lot of the coaches picked them to finish second and not first in the WCC, is because a lot of new guys, a lot of unknowns. Who are these guys? Is Steele Venters going to be able to make that transition? Probably, but we don't know. Is Braden Huff going to make that next step? Is Nolan Hickman going to turn out to be one of the better scorers on that team? Is Dusty Stromer going to develop quickly in the WCC? There's question marks about what some of these pieces are going to be, what this is going to lead to. And the amount of questions about Gonzaga is chief amongst why I think they were picked second and why St. Mary's was picked first. St. Mary's has fewer questions. You know what St. Mary's is. You know what the pieces are. A lot of the roster came back. Known commodities are what St. Mary's brings. Gonzaga brings more unknown. So Is Gonzaga going to be? Do I think they're going to finish second? Now, I actually do think that that's probably where I have them this year. Again, partly because of the continuity that St. Mary's brings, but also their depth. But that doesn't mean that Gonzaga is set to finish in second. They very well could win the league again. There's no reason they couldn't win the league again. There's no reason that this team isn't going to end up in the second weekend of the NCAA tournament again. This team has still a lot of potential. Do I think they're a Final Four team? No, I don't think they're quite that good. But with a point guard like Ryan Nembhard, with guys like Graham Ike and Anton Watson, there's a chance that they can still get to that second weekend. I think that the streak of Sweet 16's second weekend appearances is pretty safe. I think going into this year, obviously we know they're back in the NCAA. They're going to be back in the NCAA tournament. We obviously know they're going to win at least one game like that. There are some things about this program that you just know are going to happen. Those things are going to happen. They've been 8 straight Sweet 16s. Do they get back? Probably. I don't think I would feel very safe in saying they get back to the Sweet 16. Do they advance past that? That's hard to say. I think that's largely going to be upon matchups and who they end up facing and how this bench, how this second unit really starts to round out for the Zags. I would say I think Sweet 16 is probably their ceiling this year. I think Elite 8 would be hard, even though they have been in 3 Elite 8s in the last 4 tournaments. But that was with Drew Timme, one of the best college basketball players ever. And you don't have Drew Timme anymore. And that's just the heart. That's just a reality. This was kind of like almost like a peak, the glory years of Gonzaga basketball, because you had one of the premier players in all of the sport. It's like when it was like the Adam Morrison years, when like he was the king of college basketball. Drew Timme arguably was the king of college basketball. And for a few years, you were at the peak. You were in a title game. You're Elite 8 for 3 of those 4 years. And of course, one of those being a Final Four year and a title game year. That doesn't come around all that often. And I think the expectations can still be high, but I think they need to be met with a little bit of reality of who's no longer here. The program is the program, but when you have a guy like Drew Timme, he does make that much of a difference, especially at the college level. So taking a look at Gonzaga's schedule, and I think that's something that is going to be a challenge early on. I mean, I'm looking at this and I'm actually a little, not concerned, but don't be surprised if Gonzaga actually has a few, if not more than a few losses in the non-conference. And I say that really because we talked about the unknowns of what this team is. And yes, a lot of teams have a lot of unknowns, but remember how everyone was freaking out about how Gonzaga had, I think it was 3 losses in the non-conference last year. And that was with Drew Timme, with a team that we knew what they were, and everyone was freaking out. Now we have a team of unknowns, a lot of unknowns, some known, some unknown, but a lot of pieces of like, what is this team going to be? I mean, starting with the Maui Invitational, I don't think they're beating Purdue. I think that's going to be a long shot. Then they have Tennessee or Syracuse. I mean, if they lose to Purdue, maybe they probably get Syracuse, but who knows if they get that matchup. And the Maui is just loaded this year. It would not surprise me if Gonzaga came out with 2 losses in the Maui. USC later in the non-conference. I mean, I think that's probably a game they get, but that's still, I think, it's not going to be an easy one down in Vegas. They have UConn later in the non-conference. We saw what UConn did to them a year ago, and that was with Drew Timme. That was with what I thought was a better roster, 1 through 8. UConn does bring back a lot of the same pieces. How is how is Gonzaga going to respond to that? And maybe there's some sort of memory loss because you have a lot of new pieces. They weren't the team that these weren't the guys who lost to UConn by 30 in the tournament a year ago. But UConn's going to remember. UConn's I think that's going to be a tough one for Gonzaga as well. I think that's probably a loss. Then the San Diego State game in Spokane, that one, I think that's going to be one of like the better games of the non-conference. San Diego State is much more like the St. Mary's team of a year ago, where they're going to drag Gonzaga into a dogfight. They're going to scrap and claw and try to make this ugly. And with San Diego State, I could see that going either way. So like just between UConn, the Maui, I could see at least 3 losses in the non-conference, and we haven't even talked about the fact that they have Kentucky in the middle of February, which, early on Kentucky, I might have said it's like you can kind of catch them off guard early. But by the time you get into February, in the middle of conference play, they might be revved up a little bit more. They might be in a little bit more of a flow. The one thing is, I don't want Gonzaga people to freak out and think that just because they lose a few of these games that means it's doomsday, because it's not. I mean, unless you're considering doomsday not being a top 3 seed, which that is very well possible. If they lose a couple of these games, lose those big matchups, maybe they are a 4 seed rather than a 3 or a 2. If they lose more than you think they should, maybe they drop to a 5. And that will be a big difference from where we've seen them the last handful of years. That'll be different from where we've seen them the last 8 or so years, being down at a 4 or 5 seed. So I think these early games are going to be a great indicator of what this Gonzaga team might be, where it still needs to grow, where what pieces work with what people. So very early on, hard to tell right now. I think these early games, I think the Maui's going to tell us a lot about this Gonzaga team and whether or not they're going to be a 2-3. I don't see them. They're not a 1 seed. They're not that good this year. But are they going to be a 4 or 5, or are they a 2 or a 3? I think there's room in between those. And these non-conference games, I think, are going to make the difference between one or the other. So total wrap up of Gonzaga. They're not as good as a year ago. I don't expect them to go out deep into the tournament as a year ago. I do think that there's probably somewhere between. They'll get to this. I think they're still a second weekend team. I probably would have them between a 3 and a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament. But I expect them to struggle early. I expect them to hit some bumps in the road early on. And Zag fans, don't freak out. It'll be all right. They'll be in the tournament. They'll do well. But just maybe pull back the expectations from the last few years just a bit.